One of history's greatest conquerors vanished not once, but twice. First, Alexander the Great died suddenly at age 32 in Babylon.
Alexander the Great dies. In life, he had been this invincible military conqueror who had taken over so much of the world.
Then his body, once housed in one of the ancient world's most magnificent tombs, disappeared completely from historical record.
We go from having the tomb of Alexander the Great to nothing. It's like one of the wonders of the ancient world just vanishes from the face of the earth.
For centuries, scholars have debated both mysteries. What killed the undefeated general who created an empire stretching from Greece to India? And where did his remains ultimately end up? Recent discoveries and modern medical theories may finally provide answers to these enduring questions. The disappearance of Alexander the Great might finally be solved, revealing a tale more fascinating than even the legends that surround him. In June of 323 BC, Alexander the Great was planning his next conquest. After subduing Persia, Egypt, and pushing east to the borders of India, the 32-year-old Macedonian king was preparing campaigns against Arabia when tragedy struck. While attending a banquet in the magnificent palace of Nebuchadnezzar II in Babylon, Alexander drank heavily, a habit that had become concerning to those around him. Within days, he fell ill. The accounts of Alexander's final days come to us primarily through what historians call the royal diaries or ephemerides, believed to be compiled by his secretary, Eumenes of Cardia. These records paint a grim picture of his decline. The illness began with chills, sweats, and exhaustion. Soon he developed a high fever that wouldn't break. Alexander complained of severe abdominal pain, and as the days passed, his condition deteriorated rapidly. By the 10th day of his illness, Alexander could barely speak, possibly due to a previous neck injury sustained during the siege of Syropolis years earlier. His generals and companions took turns visiting him while rumors spread through Babylon about what might happen if the great conqueror died. For an empire built almost entirely on one man's charismatic leadership and military genius, the stakes couldn't have been higher. On the 12th day, Alexander's condition became critical. His Macedonian troops, concerned they might never see their king again, demanded to be allowed into his chamber. According to accounts, the soldiers filed past his bed one by one. Though Alexander couldn't speak, he acknowledged each man with his eyes or a slight movement of his hand. The scene at the palace was tense. Alexander had not named a clear successor, and his only heir was his unborn child with Roxana. When asked who should inherit his empire, Alexander reportedly whispered to the strongest, or in another version simply handed his signet ring to his general Perdiccas. These final moments set the stage for the wars of succession that would soon tear his empire apart. Outside the palace walls, the citizens of Babylon waited anxiously for news. Although Alexander had conquered their city, many had come to respect him for his policy of cultural integration and religious tolerance. Unlike previous conquerors, Alexander had embraced local customs and paid homage to Babylonian gods, earning a measure of local acceptance. When Alexander finally died on June 10th or 11th, 323 BC, the reaction was overwhelming. The Macedonians openly wept while the local Babylonians joined in the mourning. Throughout the former Persian territories, Achaemenid subjects were ordered to shave their heads as a sign of grief. Perhaps most poignantly, Sisygambis, the mother of the defeated Persian king Darius III, whom Alexander had treated with respect after her son's defeat, was so devastated upon learning of Alexander's death that she later took her own life. The death of Alexander the Great at the height of his power stunned the ancient world, but what exactly caused this sudden illness that felled history's most successful conqueror? The mystery of Alexander's death would become the first part of his enduring disappearance. What could kill a young, physically fit warrior king in just 12 days? For centuries, historians and medical experts have proposed numerous theories about what caused Alexander's sudden decline. The most compelling explanations focus on natural causes common to the ancient world, particularly the disease-ridden environment of Babylon. Typhoid fever stands as perhaps the most medically sound explanation. In 1998, a team from the University of Maryland School of Medicine conducted a retrospective analysis of Alexander's reported symptoms. They found striking similarities to typhoid fever, an infection caused by Salmonella typhi bacteria. The chills, sweats, high fever, and abdominal pain Alexander experienced match the classic presentation of this disease. Typhoid was also common in ancient Babylon, where sanitation was poor and the marshlands around the Euphrates River provided ideal conditions for the bacteria to thrive. The pattern of fever, the time frame of the illness, and the preservation of mental faculties until near the end all point strongly to typhoid fever, notes historian Paul Cartledge, who specializes in ancient Greek history. Typhoid could certainly kill within the time frame described in the royal diaries. What makes typhoid particularly compelling is that it fits with Alexander's reported drinking habits. The king was known to consume large quantities of unboiled wine, often mixed with water from local sources. If that water was contaminated with Salmonella typhi, it would explain how even a king could contract such an illness despite his privileged position. Malaria presents another strong possibility supported by scholars who have carefully analyzed the ephemerides. The parasitic disease transmitted by mosquitoes was endemic to the Mesopotamian region. The marshy areas around Babylon were perfect breeding grounds for mosquitoes, and the timing of Alexander's death in early summer coincides with increased mosquito activity. Historian Paul Cartledge has pointed out that the intermittent nature of Alexander's fever, as recorded in the diaries, matches the fever pattern typically seen in falciparum malaria, the most severe form of the disease. Alexander's fever would spike, then temporarily subside, only to return with greater intensity, a hallmark of malarial infection. The Tigris-Euphrates Valley was notorious for mosquito-borne illnesses, explains Dr. John Marr, an epidemiologist who has studied historical plagues. A king traveling with an army of thousands would have disturbed many mosquito breeding grounds as they moved through marshlands. Other natural causes proposed by researchers include West Nile virus, another mosquito-borne illness that causes fever and neurological symptoms. In 2003, epidemiologists John Marr and Charles Kalischer published a paper suggesting West Nile virus as a potential cause, noting that the symptoms align with Alexander's case. However, other researchers have criticized this theory, arguing that there's no evidence the virus was infecting humans before the 8th century AD. Acute pancreatitis has also been suggested, particularly given Alexander's reported heavy alcohol consumption. The condition causes severe abdominal pain and can be triggered by excessive drinking combined with rich, fatty meals, both of which were characteristic of royal Macedonian banquets. However, this theory has received less support from historical accounts. More obscure suggestions include schistosomiasis, porphyria, and leukemia, though these have gained less traction among historians due to inconsistencies with the reported symptoms. A 2010 analysis using the Global Infectious Disease Epidemiology Network suggested influenza had a 41.2% probability of being the cause of death, but critics note that the progression of Alexander's illness doesn't quite match typical influenza cases. What makes natural causes particularly credible is the 12-day duration of Alexander's illness. Most poisons known in the ancient world would have killed him much more quickly or shown different symptom patterns. The gradual onset and progression of his disease points strongly to an infectious cause rather than deliberate poisoning. Yet despite the strong case for natural causes, the poisoning theory persists in both scholarly and popular accounts, contributing to the enduring mystery surrounding Alexander's death. Despite the compelling evidence for natural causes, accusations of foul play began circulating almost immediately after Alexander's death. In a court filled with ambitious generals, scheming wives, and potential rivals, there was no shortage of suspects who might have wanted the king eliminated. One of the most popular theories centers on poison, specifically a substance called Veratrum album, or white hellebore. This plant, found throughout Europe and parts of Asia, produces toxic alkaloids that cause symptoms similar to what Alexander experienced: fever, abdominal pain, and progressive weakness. According to this theory, the poison was administered gradually over time, explaining the relatively slow progression of his illness. But who would have been bold enough to poison the most powerful man in the known world? The list of suspects reads like a who's who of Macedonian court intrigue. Alexander's generals, particularly those who later fought over his empire, had obvious motives. Cassander, son of Antipater, Alexander's regent in Macedonia, has been frequently named as a potential culprit. Relations between Alexander and Antipater had deteriorated in the months before the king's death, and historical accounts suggest Cassander deeply resented Alexander. According to Plutarch, Cassander arrived in Babylon shortly before Alexander fell ill, potentially carrying poison prepared by Aristotle, who had his own grievances against his former pupil. Alexander's wives cannot be dismissed as suspects either. Roxana, his primary wife, might have feared being set aside as Alexander increasingly adopted Persian customs, including the practice of multiple marriages. His other wife, Statera, daughter of the defeated Persian king Darius III, had her own political connections and ambitions that might have been better served with Alexander out of the way. Even Alexander's cupbearer Iolus, brother of his former companion Cassander, has been suggested as the one who actually administered the poison. Given his position, he would have had ample opportunity to slip something into the king's wine. However, most modern historians view these poisoning theories skeptically. Robin Lane Fox, an Oxford historian and Alexander specialist, has called the poisoning theory technically implausible, given the duration of Alexander's illness. Most known poisons of the ancient world would have killed much more quickly or produced more dramatic symptoms. The 12-day timeline really undermines the poisoning theory, explains Dr. Emily Mackle, professor of ancient history. Ancient poisons were crude. They either killed quickly or failed entirely. A slow, progressive poisoning over nearly 2 weeks would have been beyond the pharmacological knowledge of the time. Furthermore, Alexander was surrounded by his loyal companion cavalry and personal physicians. Successfully administering poison repeatedly would have required an elaborate conspiracy that would be difficult to keep secret. Given these challenges, most scholars now favor natural causes over deliberate poisoning, though the allure of conspiracy continues to fuel speculation about Alexander's death. In 2018, Dr. Catherine Hall, a senior lecturer at the Dunedin School of Medicine in New Zealand, published a groundbreaking paper in the Ancient History Bulletin that introduced an entirely new perspective on Alexander's death. Her research suggests that the king may have suffered from Guillain-Barré syndrome, GBS, an autoimmune disorder that causes the body's immune system to attack the nerves, leading to muscle weakness and eventually paralysis. What makes this theory particularly fascinating is that it resolves one of the most perplexing aspects of Alexander's death: the reported lack of decomposition of his body for 6 days after he was pronounced dead. Ancient sources, including Plutarch and Curtius Rufus, specifically mention that Alexander's body showed no signs of decay despite the hot Babylonian climate, which was interpreted at the time as a sign of his divine status. The ancient Greeks thought that this was proof that Alexander was a god, explains Dr. Hall. But this explanation actually makes sense from a medical perspective. He was probably in a deep coma. According to Hall's theory, Alexander wasn't actually dead when his attendants declared him so. Instead, he was suffering from a complete paralysis caused by GBS, a condition unknown to ancient physicians. With his breathing extremely shallow and barely detectable, his pulse faint, and no response to stimuli, Alexander would have appeared dead to anyone observing him. GBS can be triggered by various infections, including those caused by Campylobacter bacteria, which could have been present in contaminated water or undercooked meat at the many banquets Alexander attended. The syndrome typically progresses over days or weeks, matching the timeline of Alexander's decline. The key symptoms of GBS align remarkably well with the historical accounts of Alexander's final days: ascending paralysis, typically starting in the legs and moving upward, difficulty speaking, and problems swallowing, all while maintaining consciousness, at least initially. This explains why Alexander remained compos mentis, of sound mind, until just before his supposed death, as reported in the royal diaries. If Alexander developed the paralytic form of GBS, he would have been completely paralyzed, unable to move his legs, arms, and face, unable to speak or swallow, and unable to show that he was conscious. Dr. Hall writes, his breathing would have been affected, making it shallow. Ancient sources tell us that Alexander was checked for breathing by placing a feather on his face, which wouldn't have detected shallow breathing. This scenario, what medical historians call pseudo-thanatos or false death, would explain why Alexander's body didn't decompose for nearly a week. He simply wasn't dead yet. His actual death would have occurred days later when the paralysis affected his respiratory muscles completely, causing suffocation. What makes the GBS theory particularly compelling is that it reconciles the medical evidence with the historical accounts without requiring any conspiracy or exotic poison. It explains both the progression of symptoms and the unusual preservation of the body that so puzzled Alexander's contemporaries. While Hall's theory has not achieved universal acceptance among historians, it represents the kind of interdisciplinary approach that continues to shed new light on ancient mysteries, demonstrating how modern medical knowledge can help us better understand historical events. When Alexander drew his final breath in Babylon, a new chapter in his disappearance began, one that would ultimately lead to the complete vanishing of his physical remains. The journey of Alexander's body after death is a tale of political maneuvering, religious significance, and historical accidents that resulted in one of history's most famous disappearances. Following Alexander's death, his generals faced an immediate dilemma. Where should the conqueror be buried? According to Macedonian tradition, kings were buried in the royal necropolis at Aegae, modern Vagina, in Macedonia. Indeed, Alexander had transported his father Philip II's body there years earlier. Perdiccas, who had received Alexander's signet ring, initially planned to follow this tradition and arranged for an elaborate funeral carriage to transport the body back to Macedonia. The preparation of Alexander's body was itself a marvel of ancient preservation techniques. His remains were likely embalmed using methods similar to Egyptian mummification, though with some Greek modifications. The body was washed with honey, which has natural antibacterial properties, and treated with various spices and oils. These preparations allowed for the extended transport that would follow. The embalming of Alexander would have been one of the most elaborate procedures of its kind in the ancient world, notes Egyptologist Dr. Salima Ikram. They needed to preserve him for what they knew would be a long journey across difficult terrain and in challenging weather conditions. The funeral carriage constructed for this journey was described by Diodorus Siculus as a work of extraordinary craftsmanship. It featured a gold-plated chamber with an arched roof decorated with gemstones, protected by a gold mesh that allowed the body to be visible while shielding it from the sun. The entire structure was pulled by 64 mules wearing golden crowns and bell-adorned harnesses. This magnificent procession set out from Babylon in 321 BC, headed west toward Macedonia. However, politics would soon intervene to change Alexander's final destination. As the funeral cortege reached Syria, Ptolemy I Sota, one of Alexander's most trusted generals who had established himself as the ruler of Egypt, made a bold move that would alter history. Ptolemy intercepted the funeral procession near Damascus, effectively hijacking Alexander's body. This was not merely grave robbery, it was a calculated political maneuver. By possessing Alexander's remains, Ptolemy hoped to legitimize his rule in Egypt and connect himself directly to Alexander's legacy. Additionally, an oracle had proclaimed that the land where Alexander was buried would prosper, a prophecy Ptolemy was eager to claim for Egypt. Possessing Alexander's body was essentially claiming the right to his empire, explains historian Alexander Meus. It was perhaps the most valuable political symbol in the ancient world at that time. Despite protests from Perdiccas and other generals, Ptolemy successfully diverted Alexander's remains to Egypt, setting the stage for the next phase of the body's journey and bringing it one step closer to its eventual disappearance. When Ptolemy brought Alexander's body to Egypt in 321 BC, he initially placed it in a temporary tomb near Memphis, possibly in the Serapeum of Saqqara. This location was significant as it was associated with the temple of Pharaoh Nectanebo II, whom some legends claimed was Alexander's true father. However, this was just a temporary arrangement, while a more fitting resting place was prepared. Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who succeeded his father around 283 BC, transferred Alexander's remains to the newly established city of Alexandria. There, Alexander's body was placed in a magnificent mausoleum known as the Soma, meaning body in Greek, located at the intersection of the city's two main streets, a location of paramount importance in ancient urban planning. The Soma wasn't just a tomb, it was a temple complex where Alexander was worshipped as a god. The structure likely featured elements of both Greek and Egyptian architectural styles, reflecting Alexandria's unique cultural blend. According to Roman historian Strabo, who visited the site around 25 BC, the body was displayed in a gold sarcophagus. Later, during financial difficulties, Ptolemy IX reportedly replaced this with a glass or crystal coffin that still allowed visitors to view the preserved remains. The Soma stood at the literal and figurative crossroads of the Hellenistic world, explains archaeologist Dr. Mohammed Abd el-Maqsood. It represented the merging of Greek and Egyptian traditions and served as the religious center of the Ptolemaic dynasty. The mausoleum became a pilgrimage site for rulers and dignitaries throughout the ancient world. In 48 BC, Julius Caesar visited the tomb to pay homage to Alexander, whose conquests he had long admired and sought to emulate. The Roman statesman reportedly stood in silent contemplation before the preserved body of the Macedonian king, reflecting on their shared ambitions. Cleopatra, the last of the Ptolemaic rulers, also had a special relationship with the Soma. During her financial struggles against her brother in the Egyptian civil war, she reportedly took gold and treasures from Alexander's tomb to fund her military campaigns, a desperate measure that indicates both the wealth contained in the mausoleum and its accessibility to the ruling family. Roman Emperor Caracalla, during his visit to Alexandria in 215 CE, demonstrated perhaps the most extreme reverence for Alexander. He removed his purple cloak, his rings, and his belt, placing them on Alexander's sarcophagus as offerings. He also added his own personal items to the tomb, further emphasizing the continuing importance of Alexander's final resting place nearly 500 years after his death. Yet despite this centuries-long record of visitation and veneration, Alexander's tomb would eventually vanish completely from historical record. How does something as significant as the tomb of history's greatest conqueror simply vanish? The disappearance of Alexander's final resting place represents one of archaeology's most enduring mysteries, a gradual fading from historical record rather than a single dramatic event. By the early 400s CE, St. John Chrysostom wrote that the location of Alexander's tomb was already unknown. "Tell me, where is Alexander's tomb?" he asked rhetorically in one of his sermons. "Show it to me and tell me the day on which he died." His words indicate that barely 700 years after Alexander's death, the knowledge of his tomb's location had already been lost. Several factors likely contributed to this remarkable disappearance. First, Alexandria experienced significant geological changes over the centuries. The city has been subject to land subsidence, with parts of the ancient city now submerged underwater. Earthquakes, particularly a devastating one in 365 CE, damaged many structures. The gradual rising of sea levels has also changed Alexandria's coastline dramatically since ancient times. Alexandria sits on unstable ground, explains marine archaeologist Dr. Jean-Yves Empereur. "We've found entire palaces and temples submerged in the harbor. It's entirely possible that parts of the ancient city center, including the Soma, were affected by these geological processes." Political and religious changes also played a crucial role in the tomb's disappearance. The Theodosian decrees of 389 to 391 CE ordered the closure of pagan temples throughout the Roman Empire. As a site where Alexander was worshipped as a divine figure, the Soma would have been directly affected by these edicts. Without the resources for maintenance or the religious motivation to preserve it, the mausoleum may have fallen into disrepair or been repurposed. The last reliable account of Alexander's mummy being on display comes from the orator Libanius, who mentioned it shortly before 390 CE. This timing aligns suspiciously well with the Theodosian decrees, suggesting that the religious reforms might have directly contributed to the tomb's abandonment or destruction. Further complicating matters was Alexandria's changing urban landscape. As Christianity became dominant, new churches and buildings were constructed, often using stones from older pagan structures. The The practice of spolia, reusing architectural elements from ancient buildings, was common throughout the late Roman and Byzantine periods. The once magnificent Soma might have been gradually dismantled, its materials repurposed for new construction projects. The Arab conquest of Egypt in the 7th century CE brought additional changes to Alexandria's urban fabric. New priorities in city planning and construction further obscured the ancient Hellenistic layout. What might have remained of Alexander's tomb became increasingly buried under the layers of a continually evolving city. Cities don't die, they transform, notes urban historian Dr. Christina Pellini. Alexandria underwent multiple transformations, from Hellenistic to Roman to Byzantine to Islamic. Each transformation obscured aspects of the previous city layout, making it increasingly difficult to locate specific ancient monuments. By the time European travelers and archaeologists became interested in locating Alexander's tomb in the 18th and 19th centuries, the trail had gone cold. Despite numerous excavations throughout Alexandria, no definitive evidence of the Soma has ever been found, leaving the final resting place of Alexander the Great as one of history's most tantalizing lost treasures. The search for Alexander's tomb has focused primarily on Alexandria, the city that bears his name and where historical records last placed his remains. Modern archaeological efforts have identified several potential locations within the ancient city center, each with compelling evidence. The most promising site lies near the intersection of Alexandria's ancient main streets, Canopic Way and the Street of the Soma, where historical sources indicate the mausoleum once stood. This area corresponds roughly to the modern intersection of Horea Avenue and Nabi Daniel Street. Excavations in this vicinity have revealed foundations of monumental structures that could potentially be part of the Soma complex. In 1907, archaeologist Achille Adriani discovered a remarkable alabaster tomb in Alexandria's Latin cemeteries. Some scholars propose this might be related to Alexander's burial, but most experts now believe it dates to a later period. Nevertheless, the discovery demonstrates that significant burial structures from the Hellenistic period remain preserved beneath modern Alexandria. Another intriguing theory centers on the Atarine Mosque, located about 300 meters from the presumed Soma site. In the 1850s, the mosque housed a green porphyry sarcophagus that was later determined to belong to Pharaoh Nectanebo II. Given the association between Nectanebo and Alexander in Egyptian tradition, some researchers suggest this location could have connections to Alexander's tomb complex. The archaeological layers beneath Alexandria are like a complex puzzle, explains Dr. Mohammed Abdel Maqsood, former director of Alexandria Antiquities. We have pieces of evidence from different periods, and the challenge is determining which might relate to Alexander's tomb. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the 1990s revealed promising anomalies beneath the streets of modern Alexandria. However, the challenges of excavating beneath a living, densely populated city have limited archaeologists' ability to fully investigate these potential sites. Egyptian archaeologist Dr. Zahi Hawass has led several targeted excavations in Alexandria based on historical descriptions of the tomb's location. While these efforts haven't yet located the Soma, they have uncovered numerous artifacts from the Ptolemaic period, suggesting that significant discoveries may still await beneath Alexandria's streets. Alexandria's ancient city center lies beneath about 10 meters of accumulated soil and later construction, notes Dr. Hawass. The tomb is likely still there waiting to be found. It's a matter of identifying the right location and having the resources to conduct a proper excavation. While Alexandria remains the most historically documented location for Alexander's final resting place, several alternative theories have emerged suggesting his remains might have traveled much further than previously thought. These unconventional hypotheses reflect both the enduring fascination with Alexander and the creative approaches researchers have taken to solve the mystery of his disappearance. Perhaps the most intriguing alternative theory comes from British researcher Andrew Chugg, who proposed that Alexander's body might have been mistakenly identified as the remains of St. Mark during the early Christian period. According to this hypothesis, when Venetian merchants stole what they believed were St. Mark's relics, Mark's remains from Alexandria in 828 CE. They might have actually taken Alexander's mummified body. Chugg points to several pieces of circumstantial evidence. In the 1960s, a stone relief featuring distinctly Macedonian Greek artistic elements was discovered in Venice's Basilica di San Marco, where St. Mark's remains are supposedly housed. The dimensions of this relief match the size of Nectanebo II's sarcophagus, which some theories connect to Alexander's burial. The timeline works surprisingly well. Chugg explains in his book The Lost Tomb of Alexander, when the Theodosian decrees forced the closure of pagan sites, Alexander's remains would have needed relocation. The early Christians in Alexandria might have rebranded his body as a Christian relic to preserve it. While most archaeologists remain skeptical of the Venice theory, it highlights how Alexander's remains might have been moved, hidden, or repurposed during the religious transitions of late antiquity, potentially explaining why no tomb has been found in Alexandria despite extensive searching. Other alternative locations have garnered less scholarly support. In 2021, a controversial claim suggested Alexander's tomb might be in the Siwa Oasis, where he once consulted the Oracle of Ammon. However, this theory lacks substantial archaeological evidence and contradicts historical accounts placing his body in Alexandria for centuries. Some researchers have looked to Vergina, ancient Aigai, in northern Greece, where archaeologist Manolis Andronikos discovered the impressive tomb of Philip II, Alexander's father, in 1977. While no evidence suggests Alexander's body ever reached Macedonia, the royal necropolis continues to yield new discoveries, keeping the possibility alive in popular imagination. What makes the search for Alexander's tomb so captivating is that it could theoretically be anywhere, notes classical historian Dr. Richard Stoneman. While historical evidence strongly favors Alexandria, we can't definitively rule out a later relocation, particularly during the tumultuous periods of late antiquity when many ancient monuments were repurposed or destroyed. These alternative theories, while speculative, remind us that the story of Alexander's disappearance might be even more complex than initially thought.